Welcome to the Exploring Neurodiversity podcast for adults who support neurodivergent children. Whether you're an allied health professional, medical professional, education professional, or a parent of a neurodivergent child, you are welcome here. This podcast is recorded on the Aboriginal lands of the Gadigal and Bidjigal people. I acknowledge the traditional owners, elders past and present, and I extend my acknowledgement to any Aboriginal and First Nations people listening in. I'm Adina from Play, Learn, Chat. I'm an autistic ADHDer, speech therapist, professional educator, speaker, and I also support neurodivergent business owners in my other business, Neurodivergent Business Coaching and Consulting. I'm obsessed with creating a world where neurodivergent people are understood, embraced, supported, and celebrated. A world where we neurodivergent people can understand ourselves and thrive in a life aligned with our individual strengths, wants, and needs. On the Exploring Neurodiversity podcast, you'll get my perspectives and conversations with my neurodivergent friends, all about how adults can best support neurodivergent children in our lives. I bring a neurodiversity affirming approach and indeed a human affirming approach to the support that we all provide for neurodivergent kids in our lives. Let's dive in. Welcome, Marge.
Thank you so much. Great to be here.
I am absolutely delighted to share time and space and thoughts and ideas with you. You might have got the vibe already, but I'm a massive fan of your work and very honored to have you here. I'm going to just say it up front. One of the things I love about your work, your career, which I'll discuss in a moment, is just how open-minded you have remained throughout your, I think, 50 plus years of being a speech language pathologist, just honoring people for who they are and listening to individuals. And that warms my autistic speech language pathologist heart.
Well, that's really nice of you to say. No, it comes with the territory. Don't we all feel kind of that way about our clients and our cohorts?
I would hope so. Many do, and a few don't, I think, and that's important. It's just so important. I don't want it to be left unsaid. So for those who have not had the pleasure of meeting Marge Blanc, I will do her proper introduction rather than my very excitable introduction. Marge has been a clinical speech language pathologist for 50 years, and she's loved every minute of it. After 20 years working with analytic language processes in public schools across the US and Canada, she became an associate clinical professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 1993. There she met her first Gestalt language processor, a little boy who often used lines from his big brother and the movie All Dogs Go to Heaven. His mum knew all his favorite lines, and do you want to say the line? I feel like you'll say it better than I do.
Well, it's just so typical of kids, like, let's get out of here.
I love it. It's also a very motivating one, isn't it? It gets a lot done. And that line sounds like that's one of the ones that sparked his language development. And as you noted, it's just as Barry Prezant predicted in 1983. And so we're going to dig back into a bit of the history of these ways of thinking about language development. Marge has written a fantastically important, useful book, Natural Language Acquisition on the Autism Spectrum, The Journey from Echolalia to Self-Generated Language. And I myself had the pleasure of joining your training that you ran through Agoski in Australia I think it was 2 years ago. What's good about echolalia? It's language development, which I absolutely adored. And it just clarified so much for me. And we're just going to keep it going today.
Sounds just great.
And in fact, that training I checked is actually still available. So I will link in the show notes. There'll be a lot of links in the show notes for those listening, for ways that you can get more information, follow up on Marge's work and so on. She also runs one Facebook group and is a contributor to another Facebook group, which I'll link, which is called Gestalt Language Processor Natural Language Acquisition. And that's a great resource for getting more information and insights and support. And there's one more resource which Marge has just told me about, which was a conference that you participated in.
So this was a conference organized by a clinic in the UK called The Speech Den. And so the conference is called the Speech Den Gestalt Language Processing Conference. It's going to be again in another year. It was so incredibly successful. And all of your listeners have a chance to take advantage of this yet. Even though the live sessions are over, everything has been recorded. It's all available, and you can still sign up for it. All the chats are still available. So you can join in the conversations. And I will tell you that it's been the most amazing way for professionals and parents to
Mm.
come together on the same plane for, I would say, the first time in something of this magnitude. It's beautiful. So
That's
I hope you all will join. There's so many things that you'll just love.
It sounds like a really fabulous additional resource. So again, I will link to that in the show notes. And you clarified what was going to be my next question is that it's appropriate for parents and professionals, which is pretty much the groups of
Exactly.
people listening to the podcast as well. Very, very useful. So we will dive in a little bit to some of the history, but actually before that, we're going to go some definitions because there might be people listening who are not so across some of the terms that we're going to be talking about, and we'll probably end up with some acronyms just to keep our lives easy. But let's get clear on what we're talking about. So can you share some of the terms like how we understand Gestalt language processing, analytic language processing? Is there an in-between? And what natural language acquisition means in the context of what we're talking about today.
Okay, great. Well, yeah, all these terms are important, but they're only important in the context of who this child is in front of you, honestly. Because if we as clinicians and parents are looking at our child as language developing, which every child is, we can say now with confidence that if they are not doing the traditional thing that we all think that kids are going to do, that is word plus word plus word, which is the analytical way. Seems like a strange term, in a way, like an analyzing. But in a way, what it refers to is just those bits of language that are extracted from this entirety of everything a child. I mean, we're talking about a 12-month-old child, an 18-month-old child. When they can analyze it or figure it out, they get down to a word. And we all think that's just commonplace, that every child gets down to the word. But what we learned from Ann Peters 40 years ago is that no, we don't. We get down to a unit. And a unit could be a word if you're an analytic language processor, but it could be something chunkier, bigger, more melodic, more like music. And that's a gestalt. A gestalt just meaning the whole, in the vernacular of from German, that the sum of the parts is not the entirety, but it's something bigger. So that's a gestalt. And that's what Ann Peters taught us 40 years ago, is that yes, every child gets a unit out of this speech stream. But if you're looking at it more analytically, it's maybe a word. If you're looking at it more holistically, musically, sensorily, then it's a big, big, potentially, or small chunk. So that's the difference. And you say, what is in between? And so there's a lot of hypothetical that we think about right now. And Peters speculated, we've all speculated that it's not like dichotomy, it's like probably a whole continuum. But the kids who come to our minds are those who are either really successful with the word plus word, or the kids who are, as Barry Prezant would say, one of the researchers from our past and our present, if that's not the case, then who are the extreme kids on the other side? And so we've done a lot of work with those extremes, if you will. And I think the frontier of research moving forward is, what about all those kids in between? So right now we don't have a really good term for them. We call them the dual processors. Like they can take a chunk from the Gestalt and take a word from the analytic and put them together. And you see that in kids if you're paying attention, when they're 18 months old. And we don't see them in our clinics usually because they can develop language so fast. So now that we know more about Gestalt language development, we're more aware of those kids in between. And that's one of the research frontiers into the future.
Important note that the kids who are developing language quite well, I'm using like air quotes here. We don't see them in our clinics, and they might be some of the ones who are accessing language development in those two ways. I'm going to jump in with a little example of a Gestalt. Again, for those who are still getting their head around these terms, if they're not so familiar, I've got a 5-year-old and a just turned 1-year-old. And the 1-year-old is good at climbing up on things now and terrible at, she wants to go head first still. So there's a lot of, I didn't realize I was creating this little unit of turn around. This was my little turn around. And then I found Miss 5-year-old. I heard her saying to the little one, turn around. She's, she's pinched my unit. She's got excellent language, but her prompt for the baby was turn around. And then I heard the baby, who is actually speaking quite a bit, I hear her going, na, 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 na.
That's just a beautiful example. So for your 1-year-old, what is that sound stream? It's the 5-year-old giving her some support and, really putting sound on that, experience of hers. That's really a beautiful example.
It's fun. It makes me giggle. So yeah, we're very gestalty at home, we'll say. So thank you for sharing those clarifications. And so again, for the listeners, we'll probably use acronyms like GLP, which might refer to Gestalt language processing or Gestalt language processors, depending on exactly what we're talking about. We might use ALP, analytic language processing, and we might use NLA as well, natural language acquisition. So do you want to just clarify that term?
Yeah. So back when I was really introduced to this in the first place, it was 1993, which, as you mentioned, I started working as a clinical instructor, which was the name back then for an associate clinical professor at the University of Wisconsin. And because I'd worked with children for 20 years, that was my group who I was introducing to the graduate students. And so one of my very first clients was a little one who said, let's get out of here. And his mom was quick to say to me, yeah, of course he says that. Of course, that's the language he hears. So my introduction to all of this was very, very organic, if you will. I mean, a parent who understood. I had Barry Prezant's work in front of me. I had Ann Peters' book that I carried around with me, always. And everything worked just the way they said it was going to work. So I determined at that point that I was going to do exactly what Barry Prezant said I should do. He didn't say it straight to me, but in his 1983 article, he said, yeah, we've got a great thing going here. We've got a good theory. And my theory is these experiences, this language development is going to be repeatable, replicable when we look at lots of kids. So I determined after my first, little GLP said, as he was paring down his language from this Gestalt down to the single word, he did that. And he said one day, instead of, I gotta get toys, he said with all this intonation that your little 1-year-old is using, he went through those first parts of that process and he said, I toy. And I'd read Barry Prezant by then, and I knew that stage 3 was that paring down to single words. But to see that with my own eyes and my own ears and have my grad students at that time, be able to witness that was just, it just set me on my course. So over time, I developed this. It's not a protocol that comes from my thinking. It's a protocol that comes from watching kids. And so as I spent the next 15 years looking at what kids actually do in supported situations to develop language from those early gestalts, then natural language acquisition was born. And Barry Prezant had said, yeah, there's going to be 4 stages. You'll see 4 stages. And I found those 4 stages, and there were a couple more because obviously grammar, needs a little time to develop. So by the time my 15 years of research was finished, we had 6 stages. And I call that natural language acquisition simply to give it a respectable title that people acknowledged as real and, key word, natural.
That's really interesting. And I love it. And what you're saying is it describes what kids are doing, and you're just noticing what kids are doing, which leads me to this beautiful
Exactly.
quote that I heard from you. You recently were on Barry's podcast, Uniquely Human, which was a fabulous episode. Again, I'll link to that episode for anyone wanting to hear that. And one thing I loved, you said, our theory is pay attention to kids. And I just thought, oh, yes, I love it. Please, can you share more about that philosophy, that approach, and how it influences how we should all be supporting kids' language development?
Right. Well, that's great that you extracted that. And it's great that you talked about it this way and are talking about it this way because, a lot of the research in our field, was after all of this qualitative research from the 60s, 70s, and 80s, which really is the foundation of our whole profession and what we know about language development, ALP and GLP. But then we kind of entered a different age where experimental designs began, and we read a lot about that now. And in fact, we can hardly remember the days when, moms like you were quoting their 1-year-old. We can hardly remember those days, but that is our foundation. It was moms with, tape recorders, iPhones, and looking at what do kids really do. So basically, the theory of language development, then, if you're an ALP, a GLP, or somewhere in between, is just pay attention. We all are diagnosticians. Sometimes people will say, oh, this GLP thing is just too crazy on the internet. We've got too many people who are saying, oh, everybody's a GLP. Well, nobody is. Nobody's saying that. We're just saying that as, diagnosticians, and parents are diagnosticians too, like you said about your little one, who is this child? How is this child, taking in, the language world, in the surroundings? And so we all are. We're thinking, how are we going to, help promote language development? And so in that regard, we're not going to start with a theory out there. We're not going to start with GLP any more than we need to start with ALP. We're just going to be open-minded. We're just going to connect with our kids and be there. That's the beginning point. We all know that, right? That's not anything new at all.
I think so. I think some people can get a little bit too stuck in the theories. You and I, we're on the same page, and many others are. And, I think there's a lot of people in that in between, almost like that in between, Gestalt and analytic processing. There's people in between those research worlds and the practice world. And, they're noticing things with kids, but they're waiting for a journal article to tell them what to do. But anyway, we'll head down that path eventually. But I wonder if you've touched on some of the history of Gestalt language processing research, NLA research, back to the 1980s. Is there anything that we haven't really kind of touched on, any phases of this research pathway that you wanted to share, any pivotal moments that we haven't talked about yet?
Well, maybe a pivotal moment was really something that wasn't highlighted back in the day. Back in the day, qualitative research was just commonplace. And so we didn't say, oh, by the way, we didn't get just a bunch of kids and take them to a lab and have this theory and test it out. Nobody considered that. And so no one considered that their quality research, that is just paying attention to kids over time, longitudinally, was anything that was a big deal. And so maybe a pivotal moment in a way is, I would say, the resurgence of Barry Prezant talking to us about why that qualitative research was and is so important. And I think for him, he didn't realize at this conference, this same UK conference, he didn't realize that what he had to say from the past was so important. And so once he realized that, his research was pivotal, then he was able to say, yeah, it was pivotal. And that might seem like a small point, But the other thing that we urged him to say is, how did you get started with this? How did you even think to do it? And you know what the answer is? And this is the pivotal part. It was parents. He said that, he was looking at echolalia, which of course back in those days was considered pathological. And so he's looking at this thing that was considered pathological. And he said to the parents of the kids he was working with, this is his PhD. And so he's talking to parents and he's saying, what do your kids mean by this echolalia? And just like in my case with my Dylan, parents had answers. Parents knew. And so it was the parents who basically urged him to continue with his research. And I think that is pivotal because I think we're coming full circle. And I think it is something that we as SLPs, we've been kind of taught to consider the ivory tower method of looking at, our expertise. But really, it's parents who are the experts. And I think we're coming back to that. And it really is the neurodiversity movement that's brought us back to lived experiences and listening to lived experiences.
It's warming my heart to see this come from other spaces as well. And you mentioned that Barry was sharing these ideas from the past, but again, they're not from the past. They're coming back to be shared again and again in fresh ways, and to remind everybody that they're still relevant and relevant again, even more so perhaps, which is fascinating and wonderful. I mean, my whole work is around neurodiversity affirming practice, and it seems, again, so obvious to me. Why don't we listen to individuals who actually live these things? Listen to autistic people, listen to autistic kids, pay attention to kids, listen to the caregivers who know them best. It's a big, important thing, taking that step away from expert, putting expert aside.
And that's exactly the way that Barry Present says it. He said, that is the expert model.
Mm-hmm.
And we've done that for a long time. And did it get us anywhere? Not really. So in some ways, what's happened as we listen to autistic voices is I feel like we're listening for the first time. And not everyone is, of course. And that's part of what your podcast really is helping everyone to think about. What things are we not listening to and why are we not listening? And, I don't want to get into some of the research ideas that are out there now that might not be very neurodiversity affirming, but I feel like we're at a place in history where if we did not pathologize, we would have less opportunity to get big, well-funded, big-time research. And a lot of institutions would be financially in a place of debate, and I don't want to necessarily bring up applied behavioral analysis, but I mean, as an industry, I think we're finding now that you and I, and all of the people we know are being challenged more now in a way than we were 5 years ago. And I think that's happening at the level of the universities now and the funding of university research.
There's so many mixed motivations. I think questioning what is the motivation for it all is deeply important. We've got a lot of challenge going on in Australia at the moment. Our National Disability Insurance Scheme, which funds people with disability to get supports that they need. Been a broken system for a long time, but it's currently seeming to be dismantled or in the process of getting semi-dismantled by the government. It's a huge, huge issue, but they're picking apart what supports are acceptable according to the government to be funded and what's not acceptable. It's very much a challenge to actually have supports that are affirming and in line with what the NDIS scheme was initially there to do, to support people to live their best life. And it's back to this, you can only seek supports if there's a big problem, and then you have to paint things as a big problem. And again, the motivations are very misaligned. I don't have an answer for that. I have only fears for that. And I've spent a lot of time educating speech therapists how they can both be neurodiversity affirming in the care for kids and also paint a very clear picture that this child needs support. Both those things can be true and valid. So there is a middle ground. There's a lot of gray area in our chat today. There is a middle space where kids can be seen for who they are. Kids can be affirmed for who they are and their way of communicating, their way of naturally developing, and also need some support. These things can both be true.
Absolutely, absolutely. And if support is in an area that helps a person become, this is the way I say it, become who they already are, then that is the way that we can be respectful.
What a beautiful way to frame it. I love that. And so much of it as well is like, how do we help the people around them, the parents, the educators, the teachers, to see who that person is and how best to meet them there. What a beautiful way to see it. I'm going to breathe on that one. Wow. Thank you. Now, your book was published 12 years ago initially?
Yeah, that was 12 years ago. It's time for a revision.
Well, so can you share what are you seeing are the shifts in our understanding of Gestalt language processing? What are the key revisions on your mind?
Nice. Good question. So I would say that, as you were mentioning, we don't get to see really the dual processors in our clinics because they don't need much support, typically. Now, people will say, well, don't they need some support? And I say, well, it depends, as this goes back to what you just said. It goes back to what kind of support is the support someone needs. And so for families who have a child who is a dual processor, sometimes they're just confused. It's like, well, it sounds like Gestalt language processing, but it's different. So I think in that case, support is just simply understanding. And so that's why that is my kind of research interest going into the future here, is looking at those individuals who are not the extreme, of Gestalt language processing, who might need something as big, if you will, as natural language acquisition, my 6 stage hierarchy, not hierarchy, but process, but might need something that is like very specially designed for them. So maybe the chunk, if you will, the Gestalt, is not really the whole sensory, motor, experiential, emotional, big Gestalt, but maybe it's a smaller one. Like Ann Peters said back in her research, if you have a frame that fits you and you have a place for a slot that fits you, then your language development is supported. And I realized that I didn't go into great detail. We don't have great detail, but it's almost like one child who I've gotten to know fairly well has a mom who is very much like her. And so the kind of chunkiness of their life is like in the box. Oh, that one. Well, I don't know. So this mix of intonational contours, this mix of chunks. And so when this child puts together these chunks, what Ann Peters would have predicted, it's like, oh, it's in the box over there. Oh. And it's like not the melodic contour that we expect from an extreme Gestalt language processor, nor is it the word plus word, but it's something in between. And I suspect there are all kinds of things in between. So let's see, let's go back to your question. So clearly that's one thing, because even though those individuals in between might not need the kind of support we have in our clinics as much, those families need the support to understand that what's going on is fine. It's not strictly this, it's not strictly this, but it's good. And so that's one thing. I mean, obviously AAC for Gestalt language processors is a big item, and we know that. Obviously, older individuals, who Sheridan Forster talks about, the individuals who are 10 and older, who might not be doing grammar development like a younger child would, but what are the horizontal supports that we can give an older individual? So that is a huge issue itself. And then there's all the other things, like you said, like if you're going to support an individual to become who they are, then what about literacy? What about curriculum? What about school-based things? And how do we really open our minds to the fact that our kids, our students are, all over the map? That's big,
It
obviously.
is, yeah. And so I'm kind of linking this in with, the question of like, where are these gaps in research? So you've covered sort of AAC as one big area, literacy, and are there any other areas that you're finding a gap?
The other thing too is obviously speech intelligibility. And, we have kind of this idea in our SLT, SLP minds that apraxia of speech is what motor speech difficulties are like. But for a GLP who is looking at the entire intonational contour, we're looking at something deeper. We're not looking at, consonant sounds. We're looking at intonational support. We're looking at breath support. We're looking at being able to produce a long intonational contour, and then what that support is as we get to, vowel sounds and finally consonants, and how that, fits together with language development.
I feel like we're at the cusp of something incredibly important. And I'm not saying it hasn't been happening for 40 years, but all these directions that you're sharing, these exciting avenues to understand further how can we support kids and adults, anyone, regardless of how they learn language, regardless of how they process language. There's so many exciting directions. I actually want to do 50 PhDs based on our discussion right now. I probably won't, but
No, you are absolutely right. I mean, you think about what is our literature, based on now? It's based on and how kids were delayed, how kids needed extra support. We have to do all those things for our GLPs now. We really do. Oh, you're totally right. So for graduate students right now, the future is just unlimited.
Really exciting. I'm seeing this as exciting opportunity. And I do see that there are some, researchers and speech language pathologists who are divided on the topic of GLP, ALP, NLA. Do you feel that this division has always been there? And how do you respond to critics who, I guess they're coming from different angles, but what are some of the messages that you would like to share with
Oh,
those who are criticizing these ways of understanding what people do?
well, that's such a good question. And no, to be very, very honest, my first article came out in 2005, and that was based on a 3-year study of this Dylan, who I mentioned to you. And honestly, I haven't had any critique at all until this year. Seriously, zero, absolutely zero. So I feel in a way that it's not so much controversy as it is really, I mean, I hate to say it this bluntly, but really pushback. And I think that, it just doesn't jibe with very many parts of our field and the fields beyond us. I mean, psychology, ABA, as we talked about, it doesn't jibe that this could all be natural and normal and just needs to be understood. How many things do you not study if you think that you've got a good idea? And the thing is people have been so happy with all of this for so long. I've had, as you mentioned, I had another Facebook group that still exists that's too big to, invite people into right now. But I mean, it's been around for 12 years and parents are supporting parents. And that's what's happening all over the world now. People are presenting courses in Central America, South America, India, into like Turkey. I'm doing a presentation, for a course in Turkey and Malaysia. I mean, there's a truth value that people feel. And it is, again, parents and clinicians who are with kids. But that doesn't just jibe with all of those standard systems that have been out there for a while. So, yeah, no, not until this year has there been one single bit of criticism.
Fascinating. And it's so interesting that people forget that case study and longitudinal studies are absolutely valid forms of research. And in my mind, the most valid, really. They're the ones that actually help you understand a human rather than a set of numbers and statistics.
Right.
Wow.
And you're so right. You look at who would critique this, like, that one very well-known article the first of the naysayer articles that came out. And, nobody said it doesn't work. See, that's what's interesting to me, is that of the critiques so far, no one says it doesn't work. What they say is it doesn't make sense. It's so hard to kind of figure out cognitively. How can this be? How can you start with a gestalt and pare it down and get to a single word at stage 3? And, and I will say that for people who have lived it, if you witness stage 3 yourself, you never look back. It's like, how many years in our profession have we tried to figure out how to get kids to get in their left brain and do this thing that we've tried to get them to do? Like, oh, we're going to do this preverbal thing and this preverbal thing and this preverbal thing to see if we can get them, what about joint attention? What about all these many, many things that we thought were going to get them on the same page with us and get them to do language development in our left brain, like you're supposed to. And the thing of it is if you do it gently and naturally, kids go there at stage 3. And that's part of the beauty of it, is it just happens naturally. And you think about all the autistic adults, all the GLP adults who said, yeah, that's exactly how I did it.
I'm nodding. Yes, that's me. And I've done
Really?
linguistics. I've done a lot of language learning of second, third, fourth languages, and having this framework of GLP to understand a way of learning language. Case of one, that's me. Yes, yes, yes. That is how I learn language. It's how I learn music. You're saying some of these naysayers are saying it doesn't make sense. Well, I'm saying to me, yeah, it does. And what I'd like to say back to those people who are wondering, oh, it doesn't make sense because I never learned about this, your quote from earlier, just pay attention to kids.
Do you remember your youth in that regard?
I do. And there's a story I've shared on my other podcast episode that I did around GLPs with Dr. Catherine Sanchez, where I'll share it again here for you. I'm terrified up on stage. Don't put me on stage. Put me on a podcast with my own microphone and my own computer screen, fine. But I've got a memory of, I think around age 8, where I got up on stage for the school talent quest and acted out an entire scene from Beauty and the Beast. I had different actual masks. My mum had made me masks on sticks so I could be each of the different characters. And I just wish we had video of it, because I feel like intonationally, timing wise, not only did I get it spot on then, I would get it spot on now. Like I know the whole, I know the Gestalt, I've got this. But if you tell me, like, and what was that line, or what did Lumiere say next? I'm like, I've got no idea, but let me go through the whole thing and I'll get you there.
Do you have an hour?
I mean, I'll do it if you ask, but no. And then I think about how I learn music, and again, I learned violin early and then the flute. I think if there's something about being dyslexic for reading music, that's me. I don't know a term for that, but that's me. I never understood reading music. It was incredibly effortful and confusing, but give me a tune, I can play it. And I know many people talk about this experience, the fingers remember all of that, but the tune is there, the vibe is there. I could go on and on.
Oh, that's beautiful. That's really beautiful. I
And
love
think,
that.
no, I'm just happy to put it all back together. I think there's been a risk of the world of speech pathology getting too fragmented over this. It's not controversial. It shouldn't be. It doesn't need to be. Again, just look at the individuals in front of you and have opportunities to see how they learn in different ways. And why would we
Exactly.
all learn in the same way?
Right, exactly. And I think that you're absolutely right. All we need to do really is open our minds to a spectrum of possibilities. That's all we need to do. People say, well, if I'm going to find an SLP or an SLT to work with, does it need to be this, how trained, blah, blah, blah. You just need an open mind. That's really all it is.
And I think maybe this kind of answers the question I was going to ask you next, which is how can we help speech therapists bridge this gap between these more traditional behavioral analytic approaches to supporting kids and more neurodiversity affirming practice? How can people take this approach to really understanding the kid in front of them and what they need?
Well, I don't probably have as good an answer as you, because you've thought about it maybe more from your kind of cultural perspective. But I would say that the biggest thing would be to not presume. Maybe that's it, really, is just don't presume. Maybe that's the same thing as open your mind. But if, like, I did with my very first Dylan, and I said to his mom, have you heard that line before? And she said, well, yeah. I mean, he says it all the time, of course. But, and I still have her interview from all those years ago because it was just like Barry Present. He said, I talk to families. So I have a feeling that if we get out of our little corner where we just, pat each other on the back and actually just enter the world of where kids live and the parents who understand kids, that's probably the first thing. And then the second thing is, if you go to this UK conference and listen to a lot of the presentations, I think everyone there had the same exact idea that I did. What I did was I thought, well, I'm not going to just present the same old, same old. I'm going to talk to the parents who whose children I've used as case examples in the past. You might remember one of them, Chloe from the past. So I interviewed her mother, years hence. And there were several other several other kids whose parents I interviewed years hence. And they'd say, yeah, talk about lived experience. Like, yeah, that's what happened. Just like you said, tell me about, this play I was in, and I'll tell you the whole thing. So parents really talking about their kids, not like speculatively. And I think we do that, in our field because we think, oh, there's got to be a theory out there. Then we've got to look at the research. And are we going to try it? Well, I don't know. We're going to wait for 10 years until there's another study. Well, what about after the fact? And parents are saying, yeah, this is just exactly what happened. And so, like in Chloe's case, she began her Gestalt language development journey after being considered an ALP, a very failed ALP, for a year. So that's a common story. So if you hear that story, then open your mind. If you have people you can talk to, autistic adults or GLP adults, about their own journey, or the parent of someone whose child made that journey, that's going to just open your mind right there. You don't have to believe in a new theory. You don't have to think that it's logical. It doesn't matter if it doesn't seem logical. It's true.
And it really strikes me that this is a descriptive approach. You're seeing what are you seeing? You're describing what you're seeing. You're working with who you're seeing, rather than going back to some mismatched theory that doesn't fit a person in front of you. And I referred earlier to the other episode that I've done on this topic with Dr. Catherine Sanchez. We talk more about this idea of what is evidence-based practice, and that it is so much more than the journal articles that have been peer-reviewed, or, it is so much more than that. And so much of it is working with the human in front of you and noticing, when you try something, does it work?
Exactly. And does it make them happy? Or does it feel like you're, I hate to say it, but like pulling teeth to get them to do the next thing or memorize the next, prompt? Or, when you get it right and the child is looking at you like you're just a sheer genius because you've been able to see inside their brain.
Yep.
Everything makes sense.
Especially if they've had so many of those experiences where all they've been asked to do is be not themselves, and suddenly they notice a human noticing them in their humanity. It does feel obvious now that we talk about it, but it's not to everyone.
Until they do it. And that's the trick.
Yes.
It's just, it's like you say, open your mind to the possibilities. Give it a go.
I said at the start, this is what strikes me about you and this is not just your professional practice. I imagine this as part of you as a human. This open-mindedness is something I absolutely admire. And I think there is a tendency for many, not you, many, to come at maybe our professional work and say, I know it. I've done it for this many years. I know what I'm doing, and I get it. And I think your curiosity to understand there may be a different way, and how else we can view the world and support people is absolutely admirable. So I thank you for that.
Well, you're welcome. And there's always more. And that's the thing, is that I worked with OTs all those years, but I never got to work with PTs as much. And so in terms of breast support, I think there's so much that we can add to what we are looking at when we're looking at, like you say, the whole person.
So many angles to take. Is there
Good,
anything else that you'd like to
good.
share with professionals or parents who are supporting neurodivergent kids who may be, processing language and gestalts or may not be, or maybe mixed processing as well?
That's right. Very well said. Let's see, is there anything else I would want to say? I would say, okay, I suppose this is something that's not original with me at all. But when people say, would you be willing to treat another child this way? Would you be willing to treat your own child this way? Would you be proud of yourself if you treated another child this way? That's something that we have to think about. I mean, if we're looking at, the top down, like where's the funding source? I think that a lot of the naysaying comes from that because, we all live in that world. Like, my assessment isn't going to be, weeks and weeks and weeks like Marge would want it to be, but the truth is we're all assessing all the time. So even if systems say it's got to be this, exact formula, we're always assessing. So we can always ask ourselves that question and we can say, am I willing to treat another child this way? If I am going to prompt a child to say what I think would be really useful for them, would I be willing to do that in another case? Whose child am I willing to do that with? Am I willing to let a child struggle and struggle and struggle? And what is it about a diagnosis or a label or a description of a human being that allows me to do this with one child, but I would never dare to do that with another child? We have a lot of work to do yet, obviously, and you know this very, very well. But if we're not proud of ourselves as we do whatever we do with a child, that would be the time we want to say, are there alternatives? And what about this child in front of me might suggest those alternatives?
I love those messages. I just want to zoom out and see our role as, I actually personally refuse the term speech language pathologist because of all that it brings. There's a lot of baggage in that term and incorrect terminology to me. I want to rebrand us as communication and connection therapists, perhaps. Maybe that gets closer there. We're not trying to get children to speak. We're not trying to pathologize. What we're actually trying to do is help people with communication, relationships, connection. And I think when you see it from that perspective, then we can dismantle all those prescriptive ways of doing therapy or diagnosing a child. We're just helping a kid better connect in their world. Simple.
Right, absolutely. It is simple, and you're absolutely right. Yeah, I reject the terminology also.
We have to use it sometimes, I know.
Oh my. Well, this has been a delight. Thank
Thank
you
you
so much.
so. No, thank you. I feel very honored. I feel so excited. I literally am going to go off and just dream up some big new ideas because I'm very inspired right now, Marge. And I know there's going to
What would
be.
you asked me what has changed since the book came out 12 years ago?
Yeah.
And one thing, and it's exactly what you're describing right now. And one thing that's changed is I've gotten to talk to thousands, really thousands of people. And so in our clinic, we saw kids who were not doing well in other settings. And so we didn't see the dual processors like we mentioned, but we also didn't see kids who were going to do well without physical support. So we had regulation built in. I had OT, everything was built in. So that did skew the research in that regard. No question. Did I know that stage 3 was important and even imperative? Yes, I did. I did know that. But since that time, I would say one of the things that's really expanded is I've gotten to hear, literally hundreds, if not thousands of people's stories. And so what I've realized is that stage 3 for a true Gestalt language processor is absolutely imperative. And it was glossed over during so much of the time that people thought they knew what to do with gestalts and mitigations. They thought they could go from, oh, this gestalt to maybe some grammar. And so that's happened in many places because people thought, well, we can just rush ahead. But what I've learned since the research is how imperative stage 3 is. So I realize this is probably a topic that's beyond the scope of what we're trying to talk about today. But that's part of the value of the whole natural language acquisition, protocol, if you will, is that it really does highlight stage 3, where kids really do get down to single words. And so many of the naysayer people are saying, yeah, I have to have a single word. This Gestalt thing can't be true. We need a single word. Well, we do. We do need
Have your
a
single
single
words.
word. That's right. That's right. But are we going to force it year after year after year of trying to prompt it or whatever? Or are we going to let it happen naturally? So that's one thing that's happened since all of that research came out. A new version of the book needs to happen.
Look forward to seeing the progress of that. So yeah, you're right. There's so many more directions we could go, and perhaps we can follow up in the future on a different kind of direction, different angle. I am predicting that I'm going to hear a lot from people, but especially speech therapists who listen to this. I've got some interesting feedback on previous episodes, and I know that this will be really helpful and important. So I will happily share that with you, Marge, when I do get that. And what I'm inviting the audience is, please do let me know what you've taken away. What are you curious about? What are you any light bulbs that you've had through this chat that I've had with Marge? We're listening, both of us, we're listening to what people want to hear about and learn about, and where the questions remain with curiosity.
Sounds great.
Thank you so much for your time, Marge. We'll keep in touch.
Well, thank you. All
Thank
right.
you.
Take care. Bye. Bye all.
Bye. Thank you so much for sharing this space and time with me. Thank you for being open to learning and unlearning, and to listening to the perspectives and experiences of neurodivergent folks. If you found this episode helpful, please share it with a friend, share a screenshot on Instagram, pop a 5-star rating and a review in your favourite app, and join me on Instagram and Facebook. I'm at play.learn.chat. Have a spectacular day.